It is so great to be here, and I just love what you all are doing. So it's just a blessing for me to be here. So let me just jump into the material. What my goal here is today is to give you all common language when you are discussing and talking about children who have been impacted by trauma. And that way it puts us all on the same page. So no matter what your role is, I always like to look at this from a perspective of the child. So I want all of us to throw off our shoes and get into the shoes of our children who we're working with and connecting with, and really starting to see it from their perspective. So a little bit about myself. She gave the introduction, but I have written several books on parenting children with trauma, but also books working in the school as well. The two books that I'm going to go over the material today are Help for Billy and a little bit on Classroom 180. These are really the books that will shine a little bit more information of understanding, why our kids think the way they do, why they act the way they do, why they are who they are. And it's all based off of really understanding what trauma does, what experiences of stress, experiences of fear, experiences that are very unpredictable, what that does to a child. So let's start off with just the understanding where most children, well, I would say every child, their first beginning, their first connection for every child is in the family. And for many kids, that is a great place to start. But then there's some kids where that family system kind of goes awry. But when we look at then for every child, the next level of system that every child connects with, that is then the connection of school. And then the next level of connection is where you all come in, is then within the community. And for most kids, this can be a beautiful, nice system that they have a nice beginning here, very nurturing, very loving, and that prepares them to go to school, and they're ready for school. And then outside of school, maybe after school programs or agencies that they're connected with, then this is just sort of a supportive system. But what we have to look at is that a lot of kids don't have that. And when kids don't have this really nice beginning, we have to understand what that does to who they are, what it does to their perception of the world. And so let's look at just this one system first. Let's just look at family. What do children learn in families? Now, most of us know this, but I think it's important to identify it, because this will help us then to understand if these pieces are missing, why our kids are doing the negative behaviors and why they need our outside support that they're not getting in a family. So think about in a family and you growing up, you learn how to self-regulate. You learn how to connect with others in your family, and then they learn to calm you down. And so you learn then to calm down. You learn communication skills, social skills and manners, how to connect, just how to have empathy with one another. You learn the love for self and self-identity. You actually learn a hierarchy. Now, this is really important because in a really healthy family system, there's a hierarchy of parents. Like the parents are in charge and they tell the kids when to go to bed, what to do, what to eat. But those parents in charge are there to guide, to love, to help, to support. And so a child then that grows up in a healthy family system, they learn to really respect adults, because the adults in their lives of their blueprint have respected them back. So think about that on the reverse, when kids grow up in families where maybe the adult systems that they're connecting with, the parents or the grandparents or whoever, are not kind, nurturing, and loving, then they develop a sense of, I'm not going to let you be in charge of me. I'm on my own. And that's not healthy for a child. And then children learn safety in a family, in a healthy family system. They learn life skills. They learn hygiene and self-respect. And you know what they mostly learn? Is unconditional love. And that is why we have kids then that are ready to be out in the community, ready to be in the school to learn. But you take a lot of this away, then you have kids who are missing. They're missing these really essential skills. And so then what I say has to happen, absolutely. If the family is falling apart, then the school becomes a family, and then the community becomes a family. So normally the system moves from the inside out. What I'm saying now is that we got to move from the outside in. And then we have to be able to connect with our children, to give them that loving, nurturing support. Your Be the One campaign is all about this, that in this outside community, then who is that one person that can connect with that child to make sure that they're getting that love, getting that nurturing, making sure that someone sees the special in them. Because that's what every child needs. You know what every single child needs more than anything in the world is to belong. They need to know that they belong somewhere, that they are special, that they are meaningful, that they are lovable. So again, when that falls apart, we look at the school, and I have worked with your school district and looking at this model to be able to identify those students and how to help them, and how to, of course, have consequences and accountability and teach, but to really do it in a loving, nurturing way. And then, so now this is such a privilege, like I said, to be here and be able to do it from the community aspect as well. So I'm going to use two of my favorite fictitious children. And the first child we're going to call Andy. So Andy is the child that learned everything in that list about family. This is the child then that has that nurturing family. You see that each of the puzzle pieces are together. And this is a child then that has that really loving, nurturing connection, that sort of playfulness in the family. I love this picture because it just shows this really nice synchronicity between the child and the parent. And that's what is supposed to happen. That is by design. And so when that child becomes upset, what they have is that home base to make sure that they are sort of regrouped and re-regulated and reconnected so that they can make it then in the next day and go out into the world and know that, you know what, things can happen in the world, but I'm going to be okay. I have this family base. And so that's Andy. That's Andy, that we really don't think about why Andy is the way Andy is, but Andy is this way because that's the child that has had predictability, consistency, certainty, routine, togetherness, and knowing, just that knowing that all is well, life is good, things are always working out for me. This is the child that has this sort of woven into his nervous system. So that's not the children that we're dealing with, all right? What we're going to be working with then is going to be our Billies. But let's first, before we do that, I want to look at our developmental timeline. What I like to look at as a therapist is to say, this isn't just about that child in the moment. So if you have a child that is maybe acting out negatively, maybe some bad language, disrespectful, not compliant, we kind of put all these words around some of the negative behaviors. What I want to look at as a developmental therapist is not just the moment, but what happened years ago, because that is going to determine why kids are who they are in this moment. So let's do this. Let's look at Andy. Let's look at Andy's what I call trauma during developmental timeline. Let's look at this timeline. This is in utero. This is then this child every year of birth. What we have with our Andys is this pretty clean timeline. Like I said, when kind of bad things happen, maybe there's an upsetting time, maybe a grandparent passes away. But you know what Andy has? Andy has, again, that base, that nurturing, that love. And so there's someone there, that one adult or two adults are there, or more, of course, within the family system. Those adults are there to help that child be able to process all those emotions. You all know kids, they are just full of emotions and they don't know what to do with them all. So it really takes an adult with an open heart to be able to guide a child and let them just find their way through their emotions so that they're not alone. This is why this timeline for Andy doesn't have any bad marks on it, because Andy has had somebody there to make sure that they are guided and loved and nurtured and that they're not alone. And so that's Andy. But now let's look at Billy. So Billy, as you see by this illustration, there's some puzzle pieces missing because of the history and maybe even the current situation that Billy is going through. And what I like to say is that that's trauma. So first of all, before I get into the depths of Billy's life, we have to define what trauma is. Now, do y'all like to play games? Yes? All right. We're going to play a game of Jeopardy in honor of Alex Trebek. So when I show the next slide, this is actually going to be the answer, which means you have to give me what? The question. All right. So you ready for this? The experience of feeling hopeless, helpless, and powerless. What is trauma? Well, I'm going to put in here COVID-19 because we all went through that. And if you look at this, think about, I want us to step back in our memories for the last 2 years. And we're kind of post-COVID, I hope. But there's this, think about your experiences in the last 2 years. Was there some hopelessness at some point? Was there some helplessness? There's a lot of helplessness because we got so many differing opinions from all the experts. Like, I don't know what to believe. I think every one of us can put a check mark right here of feeling powerless because there were so many things that we were unable to do or unable to change. And so I like to take our experiences and sort of relate it to our abilities. When I say get into the shoes of Billy, I think, I would never wish a pandemic on any of us, but because we have gone through it, we have experienced it. I want you to sort of take that experience and put it in a little box and hold on to that, because that really has been the experience of Billy for so much of Billy's life. So that's why I put COVID-19. But yes, the real answer, you all had it, is what is trauma? And it's important to recognize that this is not about so much an experience itself, but it is the feeling of the experience. So obviously any child coming into foster care, they're going to have an experience where they were completely powerless. They could not decide what home they're going to go to. They couldn't decide whether they were going to leave their home or not leave their home. Like everyone's making decisions for them. So that's obvious. But I also want to make sure that we're looking at the not so obvious. There are kids out there that may present like they have this wonderful family, but maybe the dynamics in the family have really rendered them a little bit less powerless and a little bit less loving. And, we don't always know. We just don't always know. So it's not the experience, but the feeling. I really want you to hold that thought. And so when we come back and we look at Billy's life, then we want to look at that this idea of trauma is not isolated to just one demographics. It is pervasive. Trauma is pervasive within our society, and it can happen from the lower economics all the way to the higher economics and everywhere in between, through every racial structure, every community. And we tend to think of it as only one isolated area, but it's everyone. I think all of us may have experiences of ourselves where we didn't have that adult, we didn't have that love. And that's kind of what we have to look at for our kids, because they need to have our support in finding their way through that. They need our support, not to change their behaviors, but they need our support to help them heal. And that's the big difference here. So as the quote says, developmental trauma isn't only about the obvious. It occurs when parents cannot meet the physical and or emotional needs of their children. So now let's look at the timeline for Billy. We saw the timeline for Andy. Well, there's a lot of things that can happen. Prenatal drug exposure, that's one of the big ones I see. Medical trauma. And we kind of say, well, that was back then. But you know what? That is the beginning of a child's life. That is when a child is being woven in the womb. I see a lot of early trauma happening because when a mother is pregnant and under a huge amount of stress, that is a baby then that is basically baked in cortisol, which is the stress hormone. A lot of babies are just born, just tuned up. If there's medical trauma, which by the way, absolutely necessary, and we are thankful for that, but sometimes we don't recognize that the medical trauma can also add to tuning up a child's nervous system. And so there's lots of things along the way, along this timeline that can happen, whether it's a depressed parent, unmet needs, any type of abuse, obviously, neglect, foster care, adoption. And yes, adoption is trauma because you lose that initial family that you were born into. And so it's a loss, it's a gain, but it's a loss as well. And so look at this list, because I think that we don't always consider that this can certainly be trauma. Looking at this bullying one, I worked with one family that they were an Andy family.
Sorry, Heather. I think you
Okay.
accidentally were muted.
Okay, I'm back on. And so this one family that I worked with, they were loving, they were kind, but this child at 12 years old had some severe experiences of being bullied. So then by 13, 14, 15, this child then was a full-on bully, a very, very challenging behavior. So it's very, very important to look at that timeline. Now, if you're working with a child and a student, you may not know their history, but I think it's important just to have that perspective, to broaden our perspective, so that when we are engaging with a student, or a child, that we kind of know in the back of our mind, okay, the question is, well, what happened? What really happened here? What's going on here? All right, so then we look at Andy and now compare and look at our Billies. These are children that have had unpredictability in their lives, inconsistency, uncertainty, chaos, loss. Now, this is an important word here, uncertainty. Again, I'm going to relate that back to COVID-19. Our lives were just rampant with uncertainty for the last 2 years. And so what has that done then also for our children in our community? They've gone through experiences of not knowing what's going to happen next, especially with school, because they're in school. Then all of a sudden, 2 years ago, all of a sudden, no, there's no school. We're going virtual. And then all of a sudden, oh, no, we're back in school. Oh, no, we're back at school. No, we're back at home. No, we're going to go back. No, we're going to do a hybrid. And so this uncertainty that they lived with was ungrounding. And so not only the school experiences, but just the culture and everything that was sort of shifting on a moment's notice. Unemployment rose. And you know what? When unemployment rises, the financial stress in the family absolutely increases. And so I actually look back then to say, well, what did we experience with our kids during the last recession, which was 2008, 2009. And so I found this article that really talked about how unemployment was linked to child maltreatment. And the bottom line that this article talked about and this study really revealed was that when times are bad, children suffer. And that's what I think we have to look at. This is the time now, absolutely, for a campaign of making sure then, more than ever, that we're reaching out and connecting with our kids and pulling them in with that adult that is going to sort of be that one that connects with them and is there to sort of absorb all this stress. Where's all this stress for the last 2 years gone? They need that one person to sort of connect with them. And you can't fix what happened in the last 2 years, but you can certainly absorb it. There was food shortages. And so there's huge dynamics around everything that happened in the last 2 years. So now we look at the timeline, not just for our Billies, but this is also now for our Andys. What we're finding in the school now is that many students that were more on our Andys, they are the ones also coming to school and also seeing really intense behaviors. And so this is, like I said, this is something that is pervasive. And so 2 years now, every single child in this nation and probably around the world, every single child then has this mark on their developmental timeline. The question is, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to help them move out of that? Do they stay locked in that stress, or is there a way to help them be able to flush out that kind of stress? And that does happen through adult relationships. That is the key. That is the key to making sure that on the back end here, we are helping our kids. I will say this, when you look at traumatic situations, what really defines that situation as a traumatic situation is we have to look at who was there for that child. Remember, it's not the experience itself, but the experience of feeling like they are connected, that they aren't alone. When kids are left alone in their stress, that's when trauma just sort of builds and it never really gets processed. And so then that is sort of the starting point for more and more and more and more of the trauma that they're dealing with. So this point right here, like I said, is the key point to make sure that we're coming in and reconnecting with our kids. And that's where all of us come in. All right. So that level of uncertainty, to recognize then that this is, a lot of kids lost this as well. Like I said, we may be focused on our traditional Billies, but what I want to also make sure you're doing is saying, okay, but a lot of Andys, all this went away for a lot of our Andes. And so that's when we have to say, let's look at this from a broader perspective. When we look at the development for a child, school is such an important part of making sure kids have their needs met, not just academically, but their social needs, their emotional needs. And so I want to show you a chart here. And this chart is looking at then understanding our Andes and our abilities. The last normal school year would be in this column. Well, let me say the last, back up. The last normal school year really is in this column. So if you have a fourth grader 2 years ago, what happened for the last 2 years? Well, it was uncertainty. It was kind of chaotic. Teachers did the best they could, but there wasn't that normalcy. And so now that student is in 6th grade. And so working with educators or at whatever level you're working with students, what I want you to see by this is that if you see them as a 6th grader, let's say you're in an after-school program and you're connecting with that child and they're a 6th grader, your expectation is that they're going to act like a 6th grader. And in normal times, that would be fair. But see, they've lost 2 years. And so their social and emotional development has been arrested for 2 years. They're behind. They're very behind developmentally. And so when you're working with children, I want you to think about, okay, well, if they're 8 years old, maybe they're acting more like a 6-year-old. Why? That's what the pandemic has done. Our kids will catch up. But again, we're just coming out of this. And so this chart is really to help us identify, if you have a 9th grader, maybe they're acting more like a 7th grader for a reason. And that's a big gap. If you know developmentally, a child that is in 7th grade is going to act very, very differently than a child in 9th grade. So that makes sense. So I want you to think about going back 2 years. Just think about going back 2 years. What we have right now is very, very stressed out children, adults as well. Now we could probably go off on a whole other conversation of understanding us, but our stress level, what have we done to help ourselves regulate? This is another important point, is that we have to get ourselves back. If we're going to connect with a child that's stressed out, we can't be stressed out either. What are we doing then to pull ourselves back into a place of calm, a place of regulation, a place where have we found our new grounding? Have we kind of gotten used to sort of the new normal? I don't know. I think we're all sort of in that transition as well. So when you think about a child that is stressed out, what I want you to think about is then 2 words. Now, these 2 words can be a pivotal change, can change everything about how we work with kids. So the first word is regulation. And by definition, that is the ability to experience and maintain stress within one's window of tolerance, generally referred to as being calm, focused, or relaxed. This term is utilized by literally every scientific discipline. Okay, so let's do an example right now. It's in the morning. It's probably maybe you had your coffee. Yes. Had you had your coffee? Yes. Have you had breakfast? Yes. Are you sitting in a chair? Are you pretty comfortable? All right. So are you regulated? Yes. But before you had your coffee, were you regulated? And the answer is probably no. And so if you're not regulated, then the opposite then is that you were dysregulated. So by definition, dysregulated is the experience of stress outside of one's window of tolerance, generally referred to as being stressed out or in a state of distress. It is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. Now, we'll go over that sentence in a minute. But in general, as I was saying, when you got up and you didn't have your coffee yet, were you dysregulated? I want to see. Yes, you were. I guarantee you were. All right. So that's why Starbucks is like the most popular restaurant ever, because they're working off of this framework. They're monetizing someone who's dysregulated and getting them regulated through an outside source of caffeine. So fun example, but this is what I want us to start looking at when we are working with children. When you see negative behaviors, when you see that child that they're not focused, they're not sitting still, they're not paying attention, they're disregarding the rules, instead of seeing that as a child that's misbehaving, can you start to see that as a child who is dysregulated? Again, when all of us start looking at this from these two definitions, it starts changing how we interact with our students and with our children. Because if you see them as being bad, that's kind of a judgmental way of looking at it. Then there's this negative sort of cloud that we put over them. Well, they're acting out, they're not being respectful. And we kind of get this agitated feel. I mean, you want to help them, but you want to help them change their behaviors. But this isn't about behaviors. You see, this is about regulation. And so here's our new role for everyone here. Our new role is, when you see a student or a child who is dysregulated, I want you to think, okay, how do I help this child get regulated? So I want you to start working between these two words, rather than saying, well, how do I get this child to behave? That's the wrong question. We want to look at, how do you get a child then back to a state of regulation? And the answer to that is you. Like, one of the number one ways to help any child move from this state up to here is through the context of relationship. Think about that. When you are upset and you are mad, or you're frustrated, or you're angry, what do you typically do? Like, do you call someone? Do you call your loved one, your significant other? Yeah, you talk to someone. Now, when you talk to them, you're probably dysregulated, and you really don't want to hear solutions at that moment. You just want them to listen. You just want them to be there. You just want them to absorb. And then, by just being able to give your story, to have a voice around that, you take a deep breath and you're like, okay, I feel better now. I mean, that person probably did nothing but sit there and listen to you. But all of a sudden you feel better because you've been able to sort of process everything. And that is really the role. It does not take a mental health degree to be able to be in the life of a child. It just takes seeing them, that when they're in that icky state, that oozing state, that's not very clinical, is it? But when they're just in that, if they're giving you the stink eye, well, what do we want to do? We want to connect with them in relationship. We don't want to say, don't you look at me that way. We want to say, hey, it looks like you're having a hard day. And by being in that moment with that child, we have a much better chance of moving them back up here. Now, most of us growing up, if we were dysregulated, what did our parents say to us? Did they say, oh, sweetheart, you look very upset right now. I just want to check in with your heart. We didn't have that. They're like, straighten up, they're like, I'll give you something to cry about. So this is a really different way of looking at it. We've always been taught that by giving attention to a child with negative behavior, that we're going to reinforce that negative behavior. That is not the case, because this is the change in our thinking, that this is about regulation, not about behavior. When we look at the brain, actually, let me go back to here. I'm going to go back to this one sentence. This sentence about affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. The basics that I want you to understand here is that if you have a child that has a diagnosis, let's say ADHD, classic one, a child that maybe even ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, and there's a slew of other ones out there. But if you know this child has some sort of diagnosis, what I want you to see is not to see that child as the diagnosis, but to see that child that they're chronically dysregulated. A lot of our Billies, they live in a state of dysregulation. So moving them up into a state of regulation actually can be pretty challenging, because they're not going to just pop up there. They're used to this. This is what's familiar. And so this does take a little bit of time. This takes time to be able to help our kids move into that state and become comfortable with it as well. So this is your brain on trauma. So when you are dysregulated, you can't think clearly. Have you ever seen a child's backpack where they come in, maybe an after school program, and things are a disaster? I mean, it is a mess. And it's not that they don't care. It's not that they just, want to be messy and whatever. A lot of times when you're dysregulated, you can't think clearly. Again, I want all of us to go back to our experience during the pandemic. Were any of you all dysregulated during the pandemic? Yes. Did you I think there's something I'm calling COVID brain. You can't remember things, like short-term memory went away. You're confused on things like what day of the week is it? Like you just looked at the calendar and you know it's Tuesday. But anyone else have COVID brain? This is COVID brain, right? This is because we were dysregulated. You can't remember things. You can't focus on things. So again, when I talk about the idea of behavior and looking at it through the lens of being regulated or dysregulated, let's look at this chart. So I've got this spectrum here between dysregulation, regulation, and then the other side of dysregulation. Let's look at on the left-hand side here. There's something called hyperarousal. Basically what that means is that this is an outward expression of how you're feeling, an outward expression that your behaviors are really going to show to the world in a negative outward way. This is a child who is unable to focus or sit still. Now, notice I use the word unable, not can't. So sometimes if we need Billy to sit still or focus, we're like, Billy, stop, just focus. He can't. The brain is in a dysregulated state. These are kids who can't adhere to rules. Sometimes they're the aggressive ones. They're resistant to directives. They talk back. They're argumentative. Now, if you all have ever worked with a child who's argumentative, a Billy that's argumentative, they argue and argue. You say goodbye. The next day they come back. They bring back the argument, right? They come back and argue and argue. They're anxious, a lot of anxiety around tests or just any normal activity sometimes, and they're impulsive. And then on the right side of this spectrum, I want you to see the word hypoaroused. This is a child then that shows an inward expression. They sort of shut down. They're defiant. They withdraw. They're tardy. They're absent. They just kind of give up. In mental health is called disassociate. All that means that they just sort of shut down. They just disconnect. They're just shutting out the world. They numb out. They kind of have an air about them that says, I don't care. Or maybe they even say, I don't care. It's not that they don't care. What's happening is that they're so dysregulated internally that they're just trying to cut the world away. Again, have you ever done that? Have you ever gotten so stressed and so anxious about something, you just want to disconnect? Maybe you want to shut your door in the office and just cut the phone off and just take 5 minutes and do nothing. I think all of us have that strategy once in a while, that if life gets too big, we want to sort of create this small little world around us. And that's what a lot of our kids do. And so these negative behaviors then are really reflections of their state. They're dysregulated. So then what we want to do is focus on regulation, because a student or a child who is regulated, they're going to be responsive. They're going to be engaged. They're going to be focused. They're going to be calm. So can we sort of let go of the behaviors and work at this level? That's our challenge. That's the real difference. And again, if all of us are on the same page looking at this with these two words of regulation and dysregulation, things can change. I tell you, I did a training for a school actually here in Boulder, and I went in for 45 minutes. So it's basically what I'm giving to you all. And in this school, it was K through 8, a lot of Billies. And so I talked about regulation and dysregulation. And then I left them my Help for Billy book, and I came back a year later. And I talked to the vice principal, and I said, hey, how are things going? She looked me dead in the eye and she said, everything has completely changed for the better. And I said, I was only here for 45 minutes. She goes, yes, but we all started looking at this from the lens of either dysregulation or regulation, because it opens up your heart. If you see a kid who's arguing, you get frustrated. You get annoyed. I mean, you try to be as loving and kind as possible, but underneath it, it's frustrating. Our abilities can be very, very challenging. But instead of seeing the arguing, they started seeing, oh, this student's dysregulated. And so their ability to move in through the relationship heightened. Their ability to move in through connection expanded. And then they were able to help that student calm down and come back and be reflective of all the regulation of being responsive and engaged and focused. All right, so those two words I leave with you. There's another concept that I want you to hold as well, and it has a good connection to that idea of regulation and dysregulation. And this is looking at this with a window of stress tolerance. This is a great little graph that you can show anybody. You don't have to be an artist. You can draw this on a napkin. I love teaching this to our children as well, and teach it to parents if you've got connection with parents. So this helps them understand why maybe their children are a little bit challenging. Okay, so here's the concept. And again, I'm going to compare our Andys and our Billies, because we're not supposed to compare children, are we? But that's all I'm doing today is comparing children, because you know what? We have a tendency to say, well, why can't Billy just be like Andy? Why can't Billy just be respectful? Why can't Billy just walk in here and appreciate everything that's been done for him or her? There's a reason. And so when we look at Andy, this line here and this blue box is representing the level of stress that Andy lives at every single day, because we all have stress, just a little bit. We got to have stress. If you don't have stress, that's right, you're dead. So stress is good. Stress is the spice of life. And so Andy has a little bit of stress. And stress can be like, I'm excited to go to school. Stress isn't always bad stuff. Stress is like, yeah, I want to go to school. Yeah, I want to go to the after school program. Yeah, I want to play soccer on Saturdays. But Billy has this big blue box, which also is representing Billy's level of stress. And so Billy is right up here all the time. Billy's stress level never goes down. If you want one word to describe your Billies, is that they have a tremendous amount of anxiety. And now you don't need a mental health diagnosis. You can see that they are just anxious about everything. And remember why? Because they live in so much uncertainty, so much unpredictability. They don't know that everything's going to be okay. I mean, think about that if you live your life as a child, not knowing that everything is going to be okay, that something bad is going to happen, because that's what trauma does. It puts you in a place that you just think that something bad is going to happen. What's going to happen next is going to be a bad thing. And so, yeah, you're going to live at this high level of stress. And if you don't have that home base, that family to go to, then you don't have a place to come back and calm down. This is now your set point. This is your set point for where you live every single day. Now, this red line is the breaking point, and we all have our breaking point. Again, you don't have to raise your hand, but who hit their breaking point during the pandemic? Okay, all right, so yes, we all have a breaking point. Andy lives at this low level of stress, so the point that Andy's going to actually hit that breaking point, and where you'll see the disrespect, where you'll see the nastiness, where you'll see the stink eye, where you see the F-bomb, all the things that we see out of our Billies. You're not going to see this out of Andy, because Andy has this really big window of stress tolerance, meaning that Andy can go to school. Andy can survive the test and be okay. Andy can then go to the after school program and be respectful and be connected and be kind, and then go home and get sort of regenerated and go back to school and do it all over again. So unfortunately, we've always said, well, Andy's kind of the good child. And then we say, well, Billy's the bad child. And again, I know you don't say that out loud, but there is this labeling that kind of becomes part of how we view children. And so what happens then, with Billy, the reason his behaviors or her behaviors are not appropriate are because Billy has a small window of stress tolerance, very small window. Billy gets up in the morning, maybe there's some stress in the family system, so that doesn't help. Billy gets on the bus, his favorite seat is taken, he gets frustrated, he gets to school, he doesn't have very good social skills and emotional skills. So then by the time he gets to a first period, he blows up and he can't make it even through the school day. Or maybe this is where you probably see kids when they get out of school, they've held it together this much, they've had this much space and they've held it together at school, and they enter your program after school into an after school program. And that's where they then blow up because they have no more space. They have no more room. So is Billy bad? No. Billy is just operating from a very small window of stress tolerance. So that's the understanding that I want you to have. And our goal then, obviously, is then not to just let Billy get away with negative behaviors. That's not helpful. But our goal, going back to that idea of regulation, is that our goal is going to be able to build this window of tolerance for Billy. So maybe then when you are interacting with that child after school or whatever the program is, or however you're connecting with them, it's all about building that window back up. And what does that look like? Well, that just means maybe that's a conversation to say, hey, how are you doing, Billy? What's going on today? Tell me about your day. And you know what? A lot of times Billy may have a sort of skewed perspective. Well, my teacher hates me. Everything's awful at school. I hate the kids at school. They're all mean to me. Everyone thinks that I'm the dumb one. Our response as the adult is typically like, oh no, Billy, it's not that bad. You're just seeing things in the wrong way. We try to correct Billy's perspective. You know what that's going to do to Billy? It's going to move the window up. All of a sudden, Billy feels like, you're not hearing me. You're not listening to me. You don't understand me. You're trying to fix me. Our job isn't to fix. Our job is to build that window of tolerance. So sometimes if you're meeting one-on-one with a child, maybe that conversation is just to say, tell me more. Wow, I didn't know your teacher was like that. You don't have to agree. I want you to be like the explorer, just to be going into these conversations with a sense of curiosity. Because when you feel heard, when you feel like someone understands you.
Sorry, still in the meeting.
Okay. When you feel like someone understands you, it builds your window. Again, relate to yourselves. And that's how we start building this window of tolerance for our Billies. Now, this is not a linear path. Here's the hard news I have to give you, is that let's say you get Billy down to here. Billy's doing great. But then something happens. Then all of a sudden there's spring break. And Billy then doesn't have school, doesn't have the after school program, doesn't have all this community support. And he goes back home to an unstructured environment, kind of chaotic. And Billy comes back from spring break like what? Yeah, right back up here again. So the building of resilience to get Billy back down, to be able to build this window, just means it's about being consistent as much as possible. So when Billy comes back to school, comes back to the after school program, or again, whatever that community service is, that you're patient. You just recognize, okay, Billy's back up again. Let's help Billy come back down. And this is resiliency. If it took you 3 months to get Billy here, then spring break happened and Billy went right back up here again, it's not going to take 3 months to come back down again. Maybe it's going to take 3 weeks. You see, that's the process. The more that Billy is surrounded by that connection, the more that Billy has the support, the more that he's going to be able to bounce back. And that's what resiliency is. It's just the ability to sort of bounce back. And that's why making sure that within the school environment and the community environment is the consistency. I cannot stress the consistency that allows Billy then to come back in here. Now, there's one point I definitely have to make, is that we cannot expect Billy to be Andy, ever. I don't believe a child that's been through a lot of trauma or is currently living through really challenging situations is ever going to be an Andy. And you know what? That's the good news, actually. I don't know why we have this need to make Billy Andy. Billy is Billy. And you know what? Trauma will create kids that have really unique perspectives of the world. It will bring out certain parts about them that never would have been brought out had Billy grown up in an Andy environment. You know, I would never wish trauma, of course, on any child, but every child that I work with, which has been thousands of kids that I would call our Billies, I have a deep love for them because they're survivors. They find their way through. They don't give up. If you have a child that maybe is just sort of naturally artistic and very creative, I tell you, that trauma is going to expand that ability. Trauma has the ability to expand sort of that natural tendency that a lot of our students have and a lot of our children have. So think about it in a good way too. Again, nothing I would ever hope for any child, but Billy's Billy. And I don't know if Billy's going to get to here. Maybe Billy's full potential is here. But I will say this. Every single child that has gone through trauma or is going through trauma has the potential to heal. So if they start here, there is always the potential to move them back down. No child ever, do I say, is just, oh, he will never get better. No, that's just not fair. But how far can Billy come back down? That's just it's going to depend on the personality, the depth of their trauma, and also who's in their life. Who is in their life right now to be able to build this back up with them? That's the power that every single one of us has to help our children heal. It's right here. It's right within our hearts to be able to do that for them. All right. Let's look at the pandemic a little bit. This is a parent with a job, big window of tolerance. What happens when a parent loses a job? Small window of tolerance. And this is a parent maybe with a job in an office, or the child's at school, and then pandemic hits. Now you have a parent at home with a job and the child's at home. Many people maybe even experience that. So hopefully that puts a little reflection into why your stress level went up. So again, understand that this is not just about our abilities. Let's expand our reach. Let's expand who we're helping to serve, because a lot of our Andys lost everything as far as predictability. Maybe the parents still had a job, but their lives were turned upside down. And during childhood, during your developmental years, that's really, really challenging. We want to make sure we're reaching out to them. And so you have kids who are just, they're revved up. They're revved up. And make sure that you're taking care of yourself as well. All right. All right. So another piece that I want to give you to help really build this understanding is really the science behind all this. And so we're going to look at the brain. And again, this is common language that I want all of us to start adopting and to be able to look at within not just your job and the role that you play in your community, but I want this to really sort of be a part of the fabric of your life. Like when you look at the news or you watch the news, that you're seeing things from the brain perspective. It actually will start helping you to understand some of the craziness in our world. All right, so there are 3 parts to the brain. This outer shell of the brain is called the neocortex. So the neocortex is the part of the brain that really separates us from the other animals in the animal kingdom, right? We're all part of the animal kingdom, but we have, as human beings, this large neocortex, which allows us to be able to have the ability to think clearly. We have judgment in this part of the brain. This is sort of the higher order of thinking. This is where morals, ethics, good judgment reside. This is where we decide to make decisions based off of right or wrong, right? And so when you're regulated, you're in this part of the brain. That's again why when Billy is regulated, Billy's behaviors are going to reflect good judgment. His behaviors are going to reflect the right thing to do. Second part of the brain This does connect us a little bit more with the animal kingdom. This is the emotional part of the brain. If you have, let's say, a dog, a golden retriever, like they're super emotional. Like I want you to relate that to like just the love and the connection. And it's all about, it's actually in this part of the brain, there's two parts, the love, which is the feeling of love, but also on the opposite side, this has to do more with Billy, is the fear. So the fear receptor is right here. But really just to think about this more in the sense that this is the emotional part of the brain. This is where emotions are processed, where when we are upset, this is where the blood is flowing. This is the blood flow at the emotional level. Now, again, relate to yourselves. Have you ever been super emotional and completely irrational? Yes. All right. And then once you calm down your emotions, all of a sudden you had some rational thought. So this is where we are a little more irrational because the rational brain then isn't dominating when we're really in that midbrain. What's important about this midbrain is that life happens in the next 15 seconds. And so it doesn't matter what happens next week. It doesn't matter if you tell me as a child, hey, you know what, you need to do your homework and you need to sit down and you need to behave, you need to participate. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do the activity we have on Friday. Well, today's Tuesday. And I don't care if I'm Billy, because there is no Friday, because I'm in this part of the brain. Life happens right now. I want what I want now, and I want to make myself happy. So I'll do what I want to do and not listen to you. We all know those experiences like that. The next level of the brain is the reptilian brain. This is the deeper part of the brain that really puts us in deep, deep survival. Hopefully we're not working with kids at the deep, deep aggressive level, but I do have to mention that a lot of times you'll have a child that's upset, right? They're upset, they're aggravated, they're angry. And then we come in as adults and we give this child rational thought, logical thinking, which by the way is all processed up here. That gets that child actually more aggravated, and then they drop into the reptilian brain. And that's where then you may have a child that gets aggressive. And then that gets into an unsafe situation. So what we want to do is understand when kids are down in this part of the brain, it's not about coming in with strong discipline and the threat of consequences. If we put more fear into a child that's in this part of the brain, they're going to drop down into here. It's what I call progression to aggression. I think every one of us has seen that happen. So what I want you to think about is this. When a child is regulated, they're working out of this neocortex. They're working from what I call a top-down control, meaning that this part of the brain, the neocortex, is going to be dominant. The decisions are going to be made from the neocortex. Again, decisions that are appropriate, decisions that are right, good judgment, forward thinking, sequential thinking is up there. But when you have a child who is dysregulated, they're working from a bottom-up control. This is, again, the part of the brain then that is all about me. It is all about what I want right now. It's all about my emotions. Here's another really important point. This part of the brain is not about right or wrong. This part of the brain is about win or lose. Have you ever gotten into a power struggle with a child that's in this part of the brain? Yeah, you didn't win. No one won because they one-up you and you try to one-up them. And you say, well, if you don't do that, then you're going to have a consequence. And you're like, well, the child says, I don't care about a consequence. You can give me 10 consequences. And the parent or the adult says, I'll give you 20 consequences. And all of a sudden, up. And then we have an explosion. Because we have put fear into a child who is dysregulated. Fear plus fear does not equal love. So here's my challenge. Can you, at that moment, go into a relationship with a child right here when they are in that midbrain? Understand they're in survival. Can you come into relationship with them at that point? It's not that you're reinforcing the negative behavior. What you're doing is calming down that brain. Your role, again, is to get that child regulated as much as possible so that they are now in a top-down control. Now, here's what I want you to remember, because I know you're asking the question. You're asking the question, well, when do we teach the life lesson? Well, when they're calmed down, you can teach the life lesson. But you cannot teach the life lesson at this point. When they're bottom-up control, you try to teach that life lesson, things will typically, almost certainly, get worse. So here's the key. You move into relationship. You calm down the brain. That child moves into a top-down control, and then you have the talk. You talk about what should have happened, what their responsibility was, how you can do something different. But you have that conversation then that is rational, that is logical. If there's a consequence, yes, but it's not done through fear. It's done to teach. It's done to enhance. It's done to empower a child rather than to fearfully try to get a child to change the behavior. All right, so I'll leave you with this question here. And let's look at what we traditionally have done first. Traditionally, we've always said, if we're working with a child, we say, well, how do I get Billy to change his behavior? Now, I've got to teach Billy to be respectful. I've got to teach Billy to be able to focus. I've got to teach Billy to really appreciate life. Well, that's about behavior. And if they're in a bottom-up control, you're going to be challenged in that. And so I want you to throw out this question. Can you do that? And I'm going to give you 2 new questions. First question is this. I want you to ask yourself, what is driving Billy's behavior? Just stop for a moment instead of jumping in and correcting the behavior. Billy, stop that. Billy, don't do that. Billy, think about this. Just stop for a moment. And in your head, I want you to think, what is really driving Billy's behavior? What is their window of tolerance? Where are they? What's their stress level? So there's 3 words here that will answer that question. You just got to figure out exactly what they are. And that's fear, stress, and overwhelm. Sometimes it's hard to see the fear, but I think you look hard enough, you can find the stress, you can find the overwhelm. You'll find that. Remember, that's that bottom-up control. That's where the fear receptor is. Now, listen, if you don't know that, you may not know that question. Maybe you don't know Billy well enough, and maybe it's just something happened you're not aware of. You can always, always go into this second question and live this out. And that is, what can I do at this very moment to improve my relationship with this child? What can I do right now? How can I just move into a relationship? How can I connect? Remember, once that child is calmed down, then you teach that life lesson. But when someone is hurting, when someone is in that lower part of the brain, that's when they need connection the most. But let's look at that from a practical standpoint. Well, here we have Andy. Andy's lovely. Andy's like, hey, Andy, how you doing? Like, I want to connect with Andy. There's this invitation that's coming to me to connect with Andy. So that second question here is easy. It's easy to move into a relationship with Andy. Oh, what do you do with Billy? Oh, here's Billy. There's no invitation for connection here. She's like, talk to the hand. And whether it's as explicit as shooting you the bird, or just got the stink eye, or just a lot of our Billies just kind of have this sense about them that kind of physically we want to like move away. So I want you to break that barrier. I want you to move into connection. Can you then come and sit on the side? Maybe not too close, right? But just sit on the side. Maybe not a lot of eye contact, but just gentle. Say, hey, Billy, what's up? And maybe Billy says, well, I hate you. Okay. What else do you hate? Like, you're Dora the Explorer. You're just trying to, with curiosity, figure out what's going on. You're trying to answer that first question. What's driving this? Because you know what's underneath all this? There's a lot of self-hatred. There's a lot of self-rejection. There's a lot of fear of abandonment, a fear of rejection. All those experiences along the developmental timeline are all wrapped up right here. And so when you see this student or this child, and you see this child, they're the same. Actually, this is one that's actually in more need of you. This is the child that needs you more than this one. This one's regulated. This one is dysregulated. And we have a tendency to pull away on that. And I'll end with this one story. I was working on an after-school program once, and it was when I first was starting this work. And we were all in the gym. Actually, this is when I lived in Florida. So it was super hot during the summer. And I mean, it was like, I don't know, I think it wasn't really summer. It was like more like April or May, because it was after school, but in Florida, it's hot. So we're all in the gym. And I saw this one Billy, and Billy was having a hard time interacting with the other kids and just not very nice, wasn't developing friendships. And that day in particular, Billy was really off. And I saw Billy go off to the side of the gym and he just sits down. And all the other adults there just ignored Billy because they're like, ugh, Billy's just off on his own. And we have a tendency to do that because, again, there's not that invitation right here to connect. And so I let myself just drop that guard. And I went over to Billy and I just literally sat down right next to him. It was a little boy, Billy. And I sat next to him and I just opened the conversation, opened my heart. And I said, what's up? What's going on? And at that moment, the tears just started rolling. And this is a kid who had this kind of demeanor, like this armor all around him, like I'm the tough guy. And I just stopped. I just opened my heart and he could feel that. I had no resistance. I wasn't there to change him. I wasn't there to fix him. I was only there just to love him in that moment. And the tears just started coming down and he just softened. And you gotta be ready for that too. Like at that moment, all I could do is just say, I'm just here for you. I'm not here to, I didn't say this, but my intention really was like, I'm not here to fix you. I'm just here to love you in this moment unconditionally. And so that's the challenge I give to you of how can you do that with any child that you are interacting with, whether it's a group, whether it's an individual. This is the student that needs you. This is the child that needs that one adult, because somewhere along the way, that developmental timeline has been injured. Their heart has been injured, and to bring them back makes all the difference in the world for their future. And you have the power to do that. So I want to give you one more place to find some resources. I am going to share my screen here. I want you to be familiar with my website. I can only give you an hour here. So if you go to beyondconsequences.com, this is the main website. There is a tab up here that says resources. You go to that tab. It has all my books. You can look at that, but the free resources I want to show you. You can get a daily reflection for the next 100 days. Just pop your name in there and email. I would suggest you actually do it for educators. It's really made for people that are just working with children as the adult, not really as their parent. Or you can do both. They're different. There's actually one in Spanish as well. That one's for the parents. And there's podcasts that you can go look at as well. There's a whole list of different podcasts that you can go into and find. There's a lot of free articles right here as well. You can just download all these articles, finding that may spark your interest. I used to do a lot of work with adoption, so you'll see some adoption work there as well. And then there's a whole in-depth Q&A. So these are actually like newsletters that I had written up, and there's a question and then a big long answer. So there's lots of content here as well. There's also a little search bar that you can find if you're looking for one particular subject matter, and you can look at that. So again, it's just beyondconsequences.com, and it is that resource button to make sure you all have more that you can do after this. I appreciate your time today, and I appreciate y'all having me. So thanks so much.